I moved into my new apartment a little over 6 months ago. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had charm. A small 2-bedroom place in a quiet part of town, surrounded by trees and tucked away from the busy main roads. I figured it was the perfect spot to start over, after everything that had happened. You know how it is when you just want to escape and find some peace. That's exactly what I was looking for. Quiet, stability, and a place where I could finally feel safe. The first few weeks went by like a blur of unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and getting familiar with the area. Everything seemed perfect. My apartment was cozy, and I quickly got into a routine. Early mornings with coffee on the balcony, evening walks to clear my mind. My neighbors were friendly but not overly intrusive, which was exactly what I needed. One neighbor in particular stood out though. He lived across the hall from me, middle-aged, clean-cut, always friendly. We first met when I was struggling to get a box through my front door. He appeared seemingly out of nowhere and offered to help. At the time, I thought nothing of it, just someone being kind. He smiled a lot, asked me how I liked the building, if I'd settled in okay. Seemed normal. He introduced himself, Paul, and said if I ever needed anything, he was just next door. Honestly, I was relieved to have someone nearby who seemed so approachable. Moving to a new place, it can be hard to feel like you're truly at home, but Paul made that easier. He was always around, offering a hand with things like carrying groceries or even just chatting in the hallway. There was nothing particularly strange about him at first. In fact, I started to appreciate his presence. After living in the city, where people don't even bother to say hello, having a neighbor who actually cared felt like a nice change. But as the weeks went on, little things started to bother me. For instance, I'd bump into him at odd times. Like I'd leave for work early in the morning, and he'd just so happen to be in the hallway, heading out too, even though I never saw him actually leave the building. Or I'd come back late at night after visiting friends, and there he'd be again, standing in the lobby, as if he'd been waiting for me. At first, I shrugged it off. Maybe he worked odd hours. Maybe he liked taking walks at night too. But it started feeling a little too coincidental, like he was always around when I was. One weekend, I was cleaning out my car in the parking lot and noticed Paul standing by his window, just staring out at me. He didn't wave, he didn't smile, he just watched. I tried not to think too much about it, but something about the way he was standing there, still as a statue, made me uncomfortable. I hurried inside and locked the door behind me. That was the first time I felt uneasy about him, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he didn't even realize he was staring. Maybe it wasn't a big deal. Then came the messages. It started small. A simple text. "Nice to see you today." I didn't recognize the number, but I figured it was someone I'd met recently, maybe from work or through a friend. I ignored it. The next day, another text. "I love your new red dress." That one stopped me in my tracks. I had worn a red dress the day before, but I hadn't seen anyone who would comment on it like that. My heart began to race, but I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was just a wrong number. I replied, asking who it was, but no response. Over the next week, the texts kept coming. Always vague, but specific enough to send chills down my spine. "You looked tired last night. Maybe get some rest. Do you still go for your walks in the evening?" Each message made me more paranoid. I checked my windows and my door locks twice, sometimes 3 times before bed. I even started keeping my curtains drawn during the day, hoping that whoever was sending these messages couldn't see inside. The weirdest part was, it seemed like whoever was texting me knew my routine. They mentioned the exact times I'd come and go. The messages became less about general observations and more specific, details only someone who had been watching me closely would know. I began to feel like I was under surveillance. It's hard to explain the creeping sense of dread that starts to take hold in situations like this. You don't want to believe that something's wrong. You don't want to feel like you're being paranoid. But at the same time, you can't shake the feeling that someone is always watching you, that you're not alone, even in your own home. And that fear, it sticks with you. It lingers in every dark corner, in every quiet moment. Things escalated one night when I came home from a late shift. I was exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open, but as soon as I stepped into the building, I had that feeling again, the sense that someone was watching me. I glanced around, but the hallway was empty. I made my way upstairs, feeling more and more anxious with each step. When I reached my door, something was off. It was unlocked. My stomach dropped. I knew I had locked it before leaving. I stood there for a moment, my hand frozen on the doorknob, trying to decide what to do. Should I go in? Should I call someone? My mind raced with 100 different scenarios, each one worse than the last. Finally, I pushed the door open, and to my relief, everything seemed untouched. But the thought that someone could have been inside, could still be inside, sent chills down my spine. I did a quick check of the apartment, but nothing seemed out of place. It wasn't until I went into the living room that I saw it. A note folded neatly on the coffee table. I picked it up, my hands shaking. The message was simple but terrifying. I'm always watching. After finding that note on my coffee table, I spent the rest of the night wide awake, pacing around my apartment, every creak and shadow making my heart race. I couldn't stop thinking about how someone had been inside my home. And not just anyone. A person who clearly knew my routine who had been watching me. I felt like my safe space had been violated, like there was no place I could truly relax anymore. I debated calling the police, but part of me didn't want to. What if they didn't take me seriously? I had no idea who had left the note, no concrete evidence. Would they even believe me? My mind kept going back to Paul, my neighbor. Could it have been him? He was always around, always watching. The idea gnawed at me, but I didn't have proof, just gut feelings and unsettling encounters. Over the next few days, things seemed to calm down, on the surface at least. No new messages, no more notes, nothing out of place in my apartment. But that didn't make me feel better. If anything, it made me more anxious. It felt like the calm before the storm. I found myself checking my locks obsessively, jumping at every noise in the hallway. I even installed a small security camera above my front door, just in case something else happened. I thought it would give me some peace of mind, but instead, it only made me more aware of how vulnerable I was. And then, one afternoon, I noticed something strange. I was going through the footage from the security camera, just to check if anything unusual had happened. For the most part, it was boring. Just neighbors walking past, mail deliveries, the usual stuff. But then, around 2 a.m. the night before, I saw something that made my stomach turn. There was Paul, standing in front of my door. At first, I thought maybe he was just heading to his apartment, but he didn't go inside. He just stood there, staring at my door for what felt like forever. His hands were in his pockets, and he was completely still. He didn't knock, didn't try to open the door, just stood there, watching. After what must have been 10 minutes, he finally turned and walked back to his apartment. My blood ran cold. Why would he be standing outside my door in the middle of the night? Why didn't he knock? What was he doing just staring at my apartment like that? The questions swirled in my head, but none of the answers made me feel any better. I realized then that this was no coincidence. I had to confront him. I couldn't live in fear like this any longer. But I didn't know how to approach it. Should I confront him directly? Should I ask him what he was doing outside my apartment? Or should I go to the building management, maybe the police? I was scared to escalate things too much, but I couldn't just sit by and wait for something worse to happen. I decided to start with something small, a simple conversation, something casual, just to gauge his reaction. The next time I saw him in the hallway, I made a point of stopping to chat. He was his usual friendly self, asking how I was, mentioning how nice the weather had been lately. I tried to act normal, like everything was fine, but I couldn't shake the image of him standing outside my door at 2 a.m. As we talked, I casually mentioned that I had installed a security camera, saying it was for extra safety since I'd been feeling a little uneasy living alone. His reaction was subtle, but it was there. A slight twitch in his smile, a quick shift in his eyes. He nodded and said something about how you can never be too careful these days. But there was a tension in his voice that hadn't been there before. After that conversation, things started to escalate. It wasn't obvious at first, just small things that could have been coincidences, like hearing footsteps outside my door late at night or catching a glimpse of someone through the peephole. But it was enough to keep me on edge. I started avoiding Paul as much as possible, taking different routes through the building, timing my trips to and from the apartment to make sure I didn't run into him. But he always seemed to be there. One night I came home late from work. I was exhausted, just wanting to collapse into bed. As I approached my door, I had that sinking feeling in my gut again, the same feeling I'd had the night I found the note. I hesitated for a second, then reached for the doorknob. It was unlocked. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I had locked it before I left that morning. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. Should I go inside? Should I call someone? My mind raced through the possibilities. Was someone in there, waiting for me? I slowly pushed the door open, my heart pounding in my chest. The apartment was dark and silent. I stepped inside, flipping on the lights, scanning the room for anything out of place. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the kitchen counter was a single white rose. It wasn't mine. I hadn't bought any flowers. It was just sitting there, perfectly placed, like a gift or a warning. I backed away, my hands shaking, my mind racing. Someone had been inside again, and they had left this. My thoughts immediately went to Paul, and the thought of him sneaking into my apartment while I was gone sent a wave of nausea through me. I locked the door and sat down on the couch, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak, every noise outside sent me into a panic. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. Something wasn't right, and I didn't feel safe. I grabbed my phone and called a friend, telling them everything. About the messages, the note, the unlocked door, and now, the rose. They insisted I call the police immediately, and deep down, I knew they were right. But I was scared. Scared of what would happen if I reported it. Scared of what Paul might do if he found out I had gone to the authorities. But I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. I decided that night I would finally take action. I had no choice. His decision to call the police weighed heavily on me. I stared at my phone for what felt like hours, my thumb hovering over the call button. The fear of what might happen next gripped me, but I couldn't ignore the growing danger. I knew that whoever had been inside my apartment, whoever left that rose, wasn't going to stop. And deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was Paul. There was no other explanation. Finally, with trembling hands, I dialed 911. I explained everything to the dispatcher, trying to keep my voice steady as I recounted the strange messages, the unlocked door, and the white rose that had appeared in my kitchen. She reassured me that officers would be sent over right away, but as I hung up, I couldn't help but feel a wave of panic wash over me. What if calling the police made things worse? What if Paul retaliated? I quickly packed a bag and decided I wouldn't stay in the apartment that night. I'd go to a friend's place, somewhere safe, somewhere I didn't have to constantly look over my shoulder. Just as I was finishing packing, there was a knock at the door. My heart jumped into my throat, and for a brief second I froze. Was it Paul? Did he know what I'd done? I slowly crept toward the door and peered through the peephole, my hands shaking. To my relief, it was the police. I opened the door, letting them in, and they immediately started asking questions. I told them everything, from the messages to the security camera footage of Paul standing outside my door, to the unlocked door, and the rose left behind. As I spoke, I realized just how terrifying the situation had become, and the officers took me seriously. They checked my apartment, searching every room, every corner, but just like before, there was no sign of anyone. They asked me if I wanted to file a formal report, and I agreed. The officers said they would also talk to Paul, see if they could get any information from him. My stomach churned at the thought of Paul knowing I'd involved the police. But at this point, I had no choice. I couldn't live in fear any longer. The officers escorted me to their car, and as we stepped outside, I noticed a figure standing in the shadows near the parking lot. My heart dropped. Even from a distance, I could tell it was him. Paul. He was just standing there, watching as I left with the police. His face was expressionless, cold. For a moment, our eyes met, and I felt a chill run down my spine. He didn't move, didn't react, just watched. That image of him standing there burned into my mind as I drove away. I knew, without a doubt, that I couldn't go back to that apartment. Not until I knew I was safe. I stayed at my friend's house that night, trying to sleep but failing miserably. Every noise, every creak of the house sent my heart racing. I kept replaying everything in my head. The messages, the unlocked door, the rose, Paul's constant presence. It was like a puzzle I couldn't quite solve, but I knew the pieces all pointed to him. I just didn't know how far he was willing to go. The next morning, the police called. They had spoken to Paul. He denied everything, of course. Said he had no idea what I was talking about, that he was just a friendly neighbor trying to help. He even claimed that he had never been near my door at night, despite the footage I had. Without hard evidence of him breaking in or sending the messages, there wasn't much the police could do other than issue a formal warning. They suggested I get a restraining order, but they admitted that wouldn't do much to prevent him from living in the same building as me. I felt defeated. I had hoped that involving the police would bring me some kind of relief, some sense of closure, but instead, I felt more vulnerable than ever. I didn't know what Paul's next move would be, and that terrified me. Over the next few days, I didn't go back to the apartment. I stayed with friends, trying to figure out what to do next. Should I move? Should I confront Paul myself? The thought of going back to that building, knowing that he was still there, watching, waiting. It made my skin crawl. But then, something strange happened. The messages stopped. The tapping I used to hear at night, gone. It was as if, after the police spoke to him, Paul had decided to back off. At first I didn't believe it. I thought it was just the calm before the storm, that he was biding his time, waiting for me to let my guard down. But days turned into weeks, and nothing happened. No more roses, no more unlocked doors, no more eerie encounters in the hallway. I eventually returned to my apartment cautiously at first, constantly checking the locks and looking over my shoulder. But everything was quiet. Too quiet. It took time, but I started to relax again. I began to convince myself that maybe it was over, that maybe the police had scared him enough to stop whatever twisted game he was playing. Life started to feel somewhat normal again, though I never let go of the paranoia entirely.